Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Laura Laurent, and on this week, we have the pleasure of speaking with Ramesh Ponnuru. Now, if you don't know who Mr. Ponnuru is, he is the editor of National Review and a columnist for The Washington Post. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where his research focuses on constitutionalism, economic policy, and political ideology. Ramesh, welcome to Madison's Notes.
So glad to be here.
Fantastic. Now, you yourself are a Princeton alum. You did your undergraduate studies here, and you're actually here while we're recording this in October of 2024 to speak to some of our undergraduate fellows on the future of the political magazine. Now, I want to get into the political magazine topics in a little bit, but first I wanted to touch into your time at Princeton as an undergraduate. And with someone with such an illustrious career, when you look back at your time at Princeton, what are some of the moments that come to you as being formative, that maybe in the moment you didn't think they would be the fulcrum of where you are today, but looking back, they have a different weight or value?
Well, meeting Robbie George was probably not something that at the moment I met him, I realized would be quite as important in my life as it has ended up being. But certainly that was one of those moments, and Robbie and I have gone on to be good friends and collaborators. We've written some articles together, and it's been really wonderful watching as he has built the Madison program and a real strong and thriving conservative and center-right culture at Princeton.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, did that relationship, because I know you wrote your senior thesis under his direction, and what did that relationship look like when you were an undergraduate student?
Well, I took several of his classes, including having him as my preceptor for constitutional interpretation. That was back in the days of his predecessor as the McCormick professor, Walter Murphy, teaching that class. And I also would collaborate with him when we had speakers, organizing dinners and events, that kind of thing. But we got to know each other pretty well. He was my advisor on my senior thesis, which was a little bit unusual insofar as he's in the Department of Politics and I was a history major. But the topic I was looking at seemed like it would lend itself to help from Robbie. As it turned out, Professor George told me that he had such great confidence in my thesis that I was at the bottom of his list of advisees to pay close attention to before it was turned in. So that was more just sort of working on my part after he had set a direction.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, as you describe yourself, I see some of our own undergraduates who are participating with the Madison program right now, and it's interesting to dream of who they might become, seeing that your beginnings look quite similar to some of theirs and their involvement and interactions. But
there was no Madison program there back then. That came after I was graduated.
Yeah, they have a leg up. Well, undergraduate studies can be a very formative time in belief formation, and I'm curious, how did your beliefs change over your time as an undergraduate? Do you feel as though they went through any kind of large evolution, or did you feel quite supported in ideas and values that you came to Princeton with?
I came to Princeton as a libertarian conservative, and I left having moved a little bit to the right, which is, I know, an unusual trajectory. It was an unusual trajectory back then, and it's probably more so now. But without a substantial modification of my views, I would like to think I got better informed, better educated over the course of it. But it was a fun time to be a conservative at Princeton. It was a time when you had sort of the first, you had the predecessor of wokeness, which at the time was political correctness. And at the time, we thought this was a terrible thing, and now we look back on it with a certain amount of nostalgia because it was less virulent than wokeness turned out to be. But it was fun, sort of mocking the received pieties of the political climate. And it was easier at Princeton because Princeton was not as strident in its progressivism as a lot of other Ivy League colleges were. And I suspect that's another thing that is still basically true.
Yeah, and particularly seeing that in the way that the Madison program has been able to participate in university life here at Princeton, I definitely can see that. I'm curious, so you grew up in a mixed religious household. Father was a Hindu, your mother was a
Lutheran.
Yes, that's correct. And I'm curious, did that have a large bearing on what you brought to school and what you brought for yourself? And how did that influence the way that you started to orient yourself politically?
I can't say that it did have a huge effect, except insofar as, I was an agnostic when I was at Princeton, but I was interested, and I think my interest rose in religion and Christianity in particular, and Catholicism even more particularly than that, partly through the influence of a lot of people I met, including Professor George. I had pretty limited exposure to Catholicism as a kid growing up in Kansas City, Kansas. There was, not that there aren't Catholics there certainly are, but they weren't really sort of a part of my work.
Yeah, and particularly, I had my own interactions with intellectual Catholicism at my university, and when I came to university, it was also an area that I didn't know very much about. And I think intellectual Catholicism is kind of its own breed.
Well, one of the things that at that time and afterwards, as I was thinking things through and considering it, one of the things that really drew me to Catholicism was how encompassing it is, how many sort of different styles of Catholicism there can be while remaining perfectly orthodox.
Yeah, and it's quite a large world to explore. I'm curious, did you have some of those Catholic tendencies or interests while you were at school? Because I know you converted later in life, but was that something that needed time to marinate? And how do you see that playing into your experiences developing as an intellectual?
It did take some time and some rumination and the work of the Holy Spirit above all, and a lot of great friendships I had with people who encouraged me in this direction. My late great mentor, Kate O'Byrne, National Review, being one of those. Father Richard John Newhouse being another. And, I don't know that it really had a huge influence on my political views so much as it did on the way I held some of those views. Allowed some of them to be put in perspective and gave me, I hope, more of a sense of charity and a sense of humility as I went about political argument. I think that you would find that my pre-baptismal writings were maybe a little bit meaner than they have been since. I certainly hope so.
That's great. I was about to ask, I was like, what's an example of that transition or that change of interaction? And I think charity as a virtue is a very interesting one to adopt and particularly difficult in the political realm, depending on how one approaches it.
Now, the one asterisk on my views not changing, I suspect, one can never really know these things about himself, let alone about other people's trajectories. But I suspect that I would not have become an opponent of the death penalty had I not become Catholic. And that, I think, was an example of thinking with the church, really sort of giving this view more consideration than I probably would have otherwise and becoming persuaded by it.
Yeah, well, and I'm curious specifically about abortion because that's what you wrote your senior thesis on when you weren't a Catholic, and that's often... Catholics do a great amount of work on that particular issue. And I'm curious, what were the values or the arguments that you were basing your beliefs off of in that moment versus now as a Catholic?
Sure. It's funny because people do sometimes think that I'm pro-life because I'm Catholic, when, if anything, there's a little bit of reverse causality there, that one of the things that drew me to the Catholic Church was that it was the chief institutional defender of this great but embattled truth. And I had, well before becoming a Christian, become pro-life on the ground that I just couldn't make the argument for the other side really work. It just, the idea of a kind of private right to lethal violence just couldn't be rationalized. Now, the thesis I wrote wasn't actually a pro-life thesis. I wasn't writing an argument against abortion. I was doing a historical look at abortion laws in the United States because around that time, 400 American historians, including 14 members of Princeton's history faculty, had signed a legal brief to the Supreme Court urging the reaffirmation of Roe versus Wade and making a historical argument about abortion in the United States that it was the burden of my thesis to show was false and falsified the sources on which it purported to rely and contradicted the published work of several of the signatories. And this helps explain, I think, why I went outside the department to find my thesis advisor.
Yeah, understandable. I thought it was somewhat cheeky. Part of the title of your thesis was, the project in brief. And then it was like 107 pages long. And I just appreciated that. I interpreted that as a nod to humor.
Well, I think that probably was a little bit. It was about legal briefs.
So transitioning from university to your early career then, as you emerged out of Princeton, what were some of the larger challenges that you found in adapting to the working world and tuning into the world of media and journalism?
So I had good training at Princeton and beforehand in writing. And so taking up a job as a writer was in that way an extension of what I had been doing. I had practice at meeting deadlines. And of course, that continued, but the pace of the deadlines sped up. And I've often thought that after a year or two of writing for work, that all of those papers I'd written in college would be so much easier if I were doing them over again, because I had just, wrung my hands and worried, and how am I going to fill these pages? And then I became used to the discipline of getting the word count that was needed, covering the points that were needed. It was also, of course, you had to adjust to a different audience. And the fact that you were dealing with not teachers, but with editors and with colleagues. But then maybe most of all, particularly when I started, I was doing a lot of reporting on what was going on Capitol Hill. And so unlike the kinds of academic papers where I would mostly be reading various sources, learning to cite them correctly and so forth, I would have to talk to people. I'd have to call them up. And when I first started, I remember feeling a little bit nervous about that, and really not even so much nervous as feeling, who am I to be calling these important people and bothering them? Why would they want to talk to me? But I had to get over that, because really the first day I started working at National Review, I was given an assignment where I needed to talk to, the people in the office of the Speaker of the House and to talk to the then House Majority Leader, and I just had to get over any qualms about doing that.
I can imagine small Ramesh, young Ramesh, going through that experience, and I think it's one that's perhaps universal in journalists when they're first starting out. And I'm curious, were there any particular individuals at this period of time who you felt like really embodied the type of career that you wanted when you thought about yourself in those early days? Who was it that you looked up to and aspired to be like?
Oh, there were so many. There were so many great journalists at the moment. And as a conservative, I was, of course, thinking primarily of the conservative journalists. I had sent a copy of my thesis to George Will because I mentioned him in passing. And George called me in my dorm room my senior year, spring of my senior year. And that was fun. And he asked me what I was doing after college. I said, well, I'm actually going to be working in the Washington Bureau of National Review. And I don't recall exactly what he said. It was something unusual, like Great Scott. And he had that reaction because he had worked in National Review's Washington Bureau when he was around my age in the 1970s. So I thought he said that's a great thing for you.
As the editor now, do you use your own experience, having started at National Review, when interacting with those younger and more junior level professionals? And do you see a similarity in some of the things that they're learning that you also had to go through learning? Because I know that media has changed so much. And is there a similarity of where people are starting out now in terms of the types of challenges that they're needing to overcome?
Well, they were raised in a different media culture and a different political culture as well. I do try to always make time for young people who are just starting. It can be difficult because you're busy, but I, do remember having been in a similar position to the one they're in. Some of the things that I encourage, though, are still the same as the ones that I encourage then. For example, and this I think goes very well with teaching philosophy that Professor George has, is I always encourage people to read widely and to read people with different perspectives and to be able to take on the best arguments of the other side and not just the worst ones.
That's a piece of wisdom that's not exclusive to journalism or to academia. You've been in journalism now for quite a long time, and as you think about preparing to speak to the undergraduate students here at Princeton, this is maybe an obvious question, but I'm curious about your perspective specifically. What are the things that you've seen change over your career in terms of the way that you yourself are implementing the role of editor versus the editor before you and the ones that you worked under?
Well, I've been an editor in some sense for quite a while, but I've been the editor of the magazine only for 2.5 years now. So most of my career I've spent being edited more than being an editor. And of course, the changes in the landscape of the media have a huge effect on how you do that work. When I was graduating in 1995 and came on to National Review, there was hardly even an internet. Whereas now, as an editor, I am looking at people's Substacks. I'm looking at interesting people on Twitter, and sometimes I'm using those sources to find new talent and suggesting to them, why don't you write about this topic for us? Well, of course, that wasn't at all how it worked back in the mid-1990s when there just weren't those things, and you couldn't find that talent wherever it was. It's very easy to complain about some of the negative effects of this media landscape, but I think that's a pretty positive one, that it's much easier to find a wide variety of perspectives.
I'm curious, moving into the projection of the political magazine going forward in the future, what challenges do you see the political magazine facing, or the ones that you're currently addressing in your own leadership?
The challenges to the political magazine, well, keeping pace with a very changing political environment and keeping the enterprise running when the economics of the media have shifted a lot. When I started at National Review, there was very little in the way of competition. There were not really many other places to get conservative news. On the other hand, we did have the American Spectator, and actually starting the same year that I came to National Review, the Weekly Standard launched. And in some ways, we're the only people now who are doing what we were trying to do then, which is to have a kind of broad coverage of political and cultural issues from a conservative perspective and trying to represent a kind of body of conservative thought and a conservative tradition. There are many, many other conservative voices now out there, many of them terrific and many of them I learn from every day, but I don't know that there's anything quite like that still in operation. The Wall Street Journal editorial page, for example, does fantastic work, but it's very much a voice of business conservatism, whereas at National Review, we try to give voice to that perspective, but also have room for other kinds of conservatism.
How do you see National Review meeting some of the challenges that are facing our current political and cultural landscape? And what are your strategies as an editor in addressing some of those?
Well, I think that there's a lot of issues that conservatives are debating, or in some cases debating again. We want to be a home for that kind of debate. So, for example, a few months ago, we ran an article on trade by some of the folks at American Compass who were arguing that some of the export restraints imposed on Japan during the Reagan administration really were a model that has been misunderstood. But we also had a response to that, and we ran an exchange in our following issue. More recently, we have run an exchange on the question of racism, whether there's anti-white racism, what the proper response to it is. And we had two authors who have written books related to that subject, dueling it out. So that's the kind of thing that I think we're going to continue to do, again, to try to get the best advocates of various views in conversation. We had this was actually just a little bit before my editorship, but certainly while I've been at the magazine, we had a pro and con about should the U.S. defend Taiwan if it comes to that, which is, something that was sort of largely taken for granted, but I think really does need to be aired. Whichever way we end up coming down, you need to have thought it through and not be sort of stumbling into something.
The rehashing of conversations is important because over time there's going to be new readers and new viewers, and they're going to want to be a part of those conversations as well.
And new circumstances.
Exactly. Yeah, new circumstances as well. I'm curious about your engagement with young readers, how they're engaging with the political magazine. Do you see a specific type of content or story that they are getting behind? And what does that look like at National Review in addressing the different character of the newer generations?
I am a little bit skeptical about generational generalizations. I still find a lot of different kinds of conservatives in their younger years as in their older years. The balance changes from time to time. Styles certainly do. But I find as many conservatives as ever who are interested in economics or who are interested in foreign policy or are interested in the right to life, for example. They're certainly, growing up in the Trump era is different than having grown up in the immediate post-Reagan years, as I did. But I guess that this is my sort of long-standing bias against thinking in terms of generations having a particular character.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's fair and honestly attractive as a member of one of those generations that often gets pitted in a certain identity. I don't think anyone likes that very much. So that's a very charitable extension to give in your considerations. When you speak to our undergraduates today, what are some of the things that you are going to identify for them to be aware of for the future of the political magazine as they seek to engage themselves in their future careers?
Well, I'm a little worried, given the topic, that it will end up being too self-referential. But I do think in terms of two audiences. One, potential readers, and two, potential writers. Obviously, some overlap between those categories. What I would encourage on both sides is this interest in thinking about our life in common, how it can be better ordered, and that includes listening to one another, not necessarily absorbing or agreeing, sometimes sharpening differences. That, I think, is something that really we need more of throughout our political culture, that willingness, not, again, necessarily to agree, but to listen with charity.
Who are some of the people or publications that you yourself engage with in order to get that sharpening force?
Oh, there's a lot. I try to read a pretty varied media diet. And that includes people who are to my left, progressives and liberals. It includes libertarians. It includes paleoconservatives and people who are more favorably disposed to Donald Trump than I am. I would say that at the moment, well, actually, for quite a long time, I've read Jonathan Chait and Peter Beinart being people on the left, and Katha Pollitt at The Nation. Who's a wonderful stylist. There's, of course, all kinds of conservatives. Some of my own writers, I think, are just do tremendous work. And I, in addition to valuing them as colleagues, just enjoy reading them, whether that's Dan McLaughlin, Charlie Cook, or Noah Rothman. And Bill Buckley had a nice Latin phrase about the dangers of these sorts of lists because you end up accidentally excluding other people.
I'm curious, and speaking of all these intellectuals and you yourself, the role of intellectuals in political discourse has changed over time. How do you see your own role as a public intellectual in today's media environment?
Well, the key continuity is that intellectuals have always overestimated their influence on political events. I think that the difficulty is that it's so hard to gauge one's influence, even if it has been exerted. I argued for 13 or 14 years for expanding the tax credit for children at a time that had really gone out of favor on the right. Now, can I say that when a Republican Congress and president in the end of 2017 expanded the child credit that it was partly my influence? Well, I don't know. I mean, short of Clarence coming down from heaven and showing me a counterfactual history, I won't know. So you have to be able to live with that kind of uncertainty and frustration and just decide that attempting to figure out what's true and right and spread the word is good enough.
I'm curious how you yourself balance the forces of writing and publishing and being an intellectual while also being an editor and being a leader of a very large magazine and trying to find an adequate sampling of conservative ideas for the magazine paired with your own personal work. What is that relationship like for you?
It's pretty complementary, really, because I'm reading a lot of things, a lot of essays, probably too many tweets, both to educate myself for my own writing, but also to find topics and authors that we can run. So people will sometimes ask me, what percentage of your time do you spend doing National Review things and what percentage of the time is it Washington Post things? But there's a lot of things that I'm doing for both of those. And that, frankly, I would probably be doing just for fun, even if I weren't at those places. I spent a lot of time at Firestone when I was an undergrad reading political magazines with no particular bearing on anything I was doing for school.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how rare it is, but it feels rare that one can find such kindling for their own personal introspections that you're getting to work with, as well as your role as editor at the National Review. I'm curious, so we have just a few more minutes. And I want to touch into this because you're sort of the main thinker and you're seen as the foreman for reform conservatism. And we don't have too much time, but you co-authored a book with Levin previously, and we're coming into this election season. I'm just curious, can you give us a sort of short course on how you see reform conservatism playing in our current political environment and how it's shifted since you initially, co-authored that book with Levin?
So it certainly was not a one or even a two-man show in some ways. Ross Douthat and Reihan Salam had anticipated a lot of the work that Yuval Levin and I did with them and with others. The basic idea, and I would say this sort of got going in the late George W. Bush years and during the Obama years in particular, our basic idea was that conservatism had become a little calcified and was working off a set of assumptions that dated from the late 1970s and early 1980s, so that we were, as conservatives, spending too much time thinking about the problems of yesteryear as opposed to figuring out conservative solutions to the problems of the day. And as a result of that, conservatives in politics were becoming less and less in touch with the concerns of contemporary voters. I do think that the rise of Donald Trump was in part due to the accuracy of that diagnosis, that he was able to overthrow an old Republican orthodoxy and program and formula because it had no longer come to be seen as relevant to the concerns and aspirations of contemporary voters. Where I don't think we've seen as much progress or change in the Republican Party's thinking and in conservative thinking is in actually identifying some of those solutions. That turned out not to be, I think, something that really was part of Trump's talent or interest. And his personality has had a tendency to sort of suck all of American politics into its vortex and prevent some of that work from being done. So while I think there is all kinds of interesting work being done by various conservatives, I don't know that you've got a new conservative policy program or agenda to succeed the old one that's been destroyed. But I think that at some point we are going to have that, and that all kinds of conservatives are going to, and probably some people who are currently not conservatives, are going to participate in the creation of that next agenda.
It almost seems like it might be the next stage of reform conservatism itself. Like what reform conservatism was 10 years ago is going to be very different.
The basic idea was not really to make a sort of gigantic philosophical break. It was to imitate successful conservatives of the past by applying conservative insights to the challenges of the day. And that task, I think, so long as one believes that the basic conservative insights about an objective moral order or about the value of decentralized networks and the danger of concentrated power, as long as you believe that those insights still have validity, it's still going to be important to apply them to the different challenges that our country and our world faces.
Some would argue that the Republican Party has started leaning more towards a populist direction. And so I'm curious what your response to that is and how it might inform you and the policy reforms that you seek to advocate for.
So populism means a lot of different things, as of course conservatism or liberalism or any of the other political labels that we routinely use have multiple meanings. And part of the work of politics is to fill in the content and adjust the content. I think in some respects, populism is a very good thing. I think that conservatives for too long were oriented around the economic concerns of high earners, rich people, big businesses in our country, not enough on everybody else. And to the extent populism means paying attention to people lower on the income ladder, maybe not being as obsessed with people with college degrees as a lot of Republicans and conservatives used to be. A lot of politicians in general, in some ways, used to be. I think that's a good thing. Populism, I think, can, however, devolve into pitting, sort of so-called real Americans against everybody else. And that, I think, can be pretty destructive. And that kind of populism, I think, is something that is often animated by various grievances, some of them legitimate, that have to be channeled in different and more constructive directions. And that's one of my objections to Trump, is that he has not done that.
We've gone through a perspective of some of your earlier years and through your career. Looking back, were there any large crises in your career for now that you felt gave you the tools or insights to address the challenges that we're looking at today?
Crises. I've had a pretty blissful life. We all learn things, glean things from experience, but no, I can't say that I've ever had some disastrous moment that I've had to recover from.
That is very lucky. Well, I mean, we've looked at the past, we've looked at the present, we have the future towards us. Tell me what's up for you next? What do you see and what do you see yourself pursuing in these upcoming years in your career and for National Review?
Well, as I said, I think there's a lot of flux right now in American politics and in American conservatism. And I want to be part of a renewal and recovery, a return to healthy self-government and a sensible political culture. I think there's all kinds of ways that people can do that. And I want to use my various perches at National Review and the Washington Post and AEI and elsewhere to contribute to that.
Well, Ramesh, thank you so much for coming on this episode today with Madison's Notes. It's been a real pleasure.
You're welcome. Thanks for those terrific questions.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.